And next up we have the much-awaited Brexit and US politics session with Matt Sinclair, Sam Bowman, Zoltan Kesz and Rory Broomfield.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about Brexit and EU politics. We're going to talk about what's going on back in Europe. And I think it was Tyrion Lannister said to Daenerys Targaryen, "You're in the great game now, and the great game's terrifying." And there's something of that in Brexit and EU politics. I say this as a Leave voter. I had to admit being a Leave voter in Germany within 2 days of the vote, so I'll admit it much more happily in Australia 6 months or so later, or a year or so later, best part now. But I think you can have supported the UK leaving the EU while acknowledging that the stakes in the UK's engagement with the EU and in European politics were high and are higher. That there is a throne out there to be won, if that's not stretching my little analogy there too far, but that there are this huge potential for things to go wrong in Europe. There are huge risks in European politics. And we need to be alive to both of those and alive to the structure of the policy and political challenges facing Europe, because they will reverberate around the world, because there are commonalities with what's going on in other developed and developing economies. I want to just quickly speak to 3 areas. The first is speak quickly about trade. The second is about policy, how that might change. And the third is about politics in a deep kind of what's happening to the regimes and populism sense. So firstly, let's speak about trade. I think both the EU and the UK have a very strong interest in doing a reasonable free trade agreement when the UK leaves the EU. So I don't think we should be expecting a cataclysm. Doesn't mean a cataclysm can't happen. If there can be breakdowns. I mean, I think we saw with the Canada to Europe trade deal, the potential for last-minute spanners in the works of the EU doing a trade deal. Equally, the UK, there could be political problems. I wouldn't expect them, though. I think the other thing we saw with the Canada deal, and earlier with the Greek crisis, is that when a deal needs to get done, the minor parties who want to throw a spanner in the works tend to be either bought off or threatened out of blocking the deal. You tend to find that the majority interest in doing a deal tends to prevail. What deal is open to question? How good a deal? How far we lose trade liberalisation from the strong degree of liberalisation of EU-UK trade with the single market is yet to be determined. But, and this is where we come on to the implications for you guys, we can, I think, get a reasonable sense of what a given deal in Europe will mean for the UK's engagement with the wider world. And I think the way to think about it is that the UK's trade with the EU is perhaps trending to about 1/3 of its total trade over time. It's not there yet. It's considerably more than that now. But I think if you were to set a reasonable estimate of where it'll go in the medium term, trends for about 1/3. What that means is that you need roughly 1 unit, however you want to measure it, of improvement in trade liberalisation with the rest of the world for every 2 that you lose with the EU. Now, people have put numbers on that. People have done economic studies of that. And because the EU single market is exceptionally integrated, ordinary free trade deals ain't going to cut it. The UK going around and doing average quality trade deals with the rest of the world will not be enough to make up for likely increases in trade barriers with the EU. I think we should be optimistic about EU-UK trade, but even on an optimistic read, average trade deals ain't going to cut it for the UK. And what that means for countries like Australia is that the UK is going to be in the market for a standard-setting trade deal to match the best and in many areas go further than other major international trade deals. So if you're looking at this from particular sectors, if you're thinking about what the free market movement can do in Australia, I think look to the fact that winning an Australia-UK trade deal I do not think is a challenge. I think there's a lot of political will to do that on both sides. But I think winning a deal which sets a new standard for global trade deals, which pushes the boundaries of what's possible, is a project that we should be really excited about. Next, if we come on to policy, and I think this is one of the areas which maybe wasn't appreciated with all the heat and fire of the Brexit campaign, but it's one of the most important reasons why Brexit was necessary for the UK. The EU is having to be dramatically remade in order to make it work with these key institutions of the Eurozone and the Schengen zone. That's a common currency and a common border. That's the Eurozone crisis, as you've seen particularly in Greece, and the refugee crisis, as you've seen on the march during 2016. Both of those crises are crucial because they have the ability not just to wreck governments, but to wreck regimes, to bring in dramatic populism from the edges, either from what's described as the far left, the Syrizas, or the far right, the Austin guy who became president in Austria, his name escapes me. It has the potential to bring in parties from outside what was thought possible before. And those two crises entail a dramatic remaking of the EU, which at the fundamental of why Brexit had to happen, besides some of these sorts of sillier debates that we got on both sides through the referendum, is that the UK, as a non-Eurozone member, as a non-Schengen member, was never going to be comfortable with those changes, was never going to live with those changes. We'd got to a point where the UK, as the only large, permanent non-member of those two blocs, had to find another path, and it was better to do it from a point of decisiveness and go looking for those wider trade relationships I've just talked about, than to try and stumble along. Now, what's crucial, I think, to understand about our priorities should be that as well is that the other dynamic here is that the EU, in order to assert its relevance, is harmonising a lot faster in a lot more areas than it would have in the past. So if you look at areas from like the regulation of online platforms, to the regulation of vaping, to the regulation of drones, to the regulation of to a common climate policy, there's a huge difference between what the EU used to do. Areas like trade, where people basically know the right answer, reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, to areas where the right answer for policy really isn't obvious, and where trying to harmonise too early risks calcifying the wrong decision. It's not that the UK is better at making these decisions, it's that an EU which struggles to change its mind, as any supranational organisation does, is going to stick by mistakes longer. I think climate policy is a classic example of that, sticking by policies that were failing for too long. Final area I just wanted to talk to, and I think that's where there's exciting work for the free market movement as well, in driving forward new responses to some of these new policy challenges, which the UK can now do more adaptively, working with domestic institutions. And the final area I wanted to talk about is the clash of populism, which will be on people's mind, and these deep regime challenges. Now, don't expect Le Pen to win in the French election. She's going to lose to Macron. Is the only. There's no certainties in politics, but expect her to lose. But I think worry about what happens down the road. Worry about what happens in Italy with the five-star movement. Worry about what happens the next cycle, because the French presidency is at the moment set up to disappoint. And worry about what happens if Macron disappoints people and looks like everything a French populist hates, right? A classic in mold of the French bureaucrat presidents. So Giscard d'Estaing reinvented for a new generation. Worry about that because these populists are not your friends internationally. I know there is sometimes a temptation looking from outside, seeing policy you dislike, particularly in the EU, which doesn't get the best press internationally, often doesn't deserve the best press internationally. But I say this as someone who advocates for the UK to leave. There is a huge difference between thinking the UK will do better leaving under a Conservative government for all their many flaws, thinking that Le Pen crashing France out of the Eurozone is going to make the world a better place. These are protectionist parties. They're deeply, deeply illiberal parties. They would find everything that's been said at this conference horrifying, right? These are the parties that are trying to double down on European protectionism to pretend that it protects a social model that can't work, and frankly of racism. And of deeply unpleasant attitudes, and others in this panel will talk about it. There are experts who are here on the rest of this panel in every part of these three areas I've talked about, and others besides. I don't want to kind of define the parameters for our talk too much. But Sam Bowman and the ASI, one of the venerable and greatest of UK think tanks, and one that's taken wonderfully to adapting over time with the next generation, with their online presence, and have become and have a great voice to make as a neoliberal think tank opposed to Brexit. But I think kind of on the flip side of maybe the talk I've given. Mine was a sort of relatively moderate Leave talk, I'd hope. I think yours is probably a relatively moderate Remain talk, Sam. You're not. I think that's a fair. And I think, and then Zoltan, who's speaking as someone who was one of us, part of the free market movement, coming to conferences like this as a think tanker, and now has crossed the divide and is an MP, and is really on the front line of the fight against some of the nastier populists in European politics. And finally, Rory, who, as well as being at the Freedom Association, a brilliant organisation born out of confrontation with socialism in the UK, but now being at sort of the forefront of thinking on Brexit, particularly some work he did with Ian Murray that's been enormously influential. So I just close on, European politics is worth engaging with for Australians and internationally. I think there's the potential, both in engaging with the EU knows that it needs to deliver economically for its people. It knows that it needs to engage with improving economic policy, improving trade policy. It needs to deliver in order to assuage its populist concerns. And the UK is going to be out there in global debates over regulatory policy, global debates over trade policy, in a new way, which, while we should not be in any way blind to the risks, has enormous promise. So I would be excited about the role the UK can play in the world, and I think that engaging with Australia, and Australia is going to be a crucial, and others in the region, is going to be an absolutely crucial part of that. I'm going to start handing over to the rest of the speakers, but thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming to listen to me speak. This is my first time in Australia, and it's lovely to be here. I do admit I was a bit nervous when I was going through immigration, and they asked me if I had any criminal convictions. Didn't know you still needed those to come here, but I'm glad you haven't heard that one before. I was worried that was maybe an old one. But I think I'm probably here to provide the kind of, as Matt said, sort of reasonable Remainer point of view. And at this stage, particularly in the UK, it kind of feels like the referendum never ended. It feels like we're going over the same debates again and again and again. There is, particularly on the Remain side, and I think in a very, very self-defeating way, a camp of hardcore, die-hard Ramoners is the term that some people use, who refuse to accept the result of the referendum and kind of seem intent on, however self-destructive it is, constantly pushing for a kind of second referendum. It's not going to happen, okay? It's absolutely not going to happen. We're going to leave the European Union, and we need to face the challenges and some of the opportunities that come with that. What I want to talk about in my remarks here, and I will try to stay to time, are probably some of the projections. What might Brexit actually mean for the UK? And that's my speaking time over already, but glad you enjoyed the joke anyway. But some of the projections, what might Brexit mean for the UK in the long term? And what are some things that we can do to take advantage of the good things about Brexit? So the first point to note is that EU membership has been very, very good for the UK. Nicholas Crafts, who's an extremely well-renowned, well-regarded economist, reviewed the evidence, suggests EU membership has probably raised UK GDP per capita by about 10% higher than it would be otherwise. One of the nice things about EU membership was that it complemented the Thatcher reforms, increased openness to trade, stronger competition regulation, pro-competition regulation. These kinds of rules that the EU, at that point the European Community, meant for the UK, meant that the Thatcher privatisations and the Thatcher deregulations had more teeth, and they went very well together. I think it's a very, very valid point, though, that first of all, we are not where we are, or we're not where we were 20 years ago. We're not where we were 30 years ago. So even though EU membership has been very good for the UK, it's not necessarily the case that leaving the EU will be in direct proportion as bad. The European Union right now accounts for about 45% of trade. Perhaps it's trending towards a much lower figure than that, but right now it's almost half of the trade we do. And what's important to note is that the supply chains that the UK is part of, particularly in things like electronics, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, are quite deeply integrated with the rest of Europe. So it's not simply a question of buying things and selling things, it's a question of quite deeply integrated production lines. And that's something that I think is unavoidable, that this will be disrupted, particularly in things like electronics and automobiles, where regulation can be very, very important. Having said that, the projections about the UK GDP loss, how much poorer we're likely to be leaving the European single market, are not catastrophic. I think they kind of range between about 2% and 9% GDP per capita. I think probably a more realistic estimate is around 3 or 4%, which is not the end of the world. It's very, very important not, for Remainers in particular, not to lose the run of themselves, not to buy the kind of end of the world kind of catastrophic talk, because it's very, very unlikely to happen, and it makes us look silly. However, it is worth admitting that a more difficult trading relationship with by far our largest trading partner, the largest economic bloc in the world, which is right next to us, is almost certainly going to reduce our GDP unless we do very, very radical things otherwise. I think the best way of conceptualizing it is in the kind of realistic worst-case scenario. Right now, we're not as rich as Germany. We're about as rich as France. In 20 years' time, we'll probably be where Italy is. That's not the end of the world, but that's not necessarily where I would like to be. Having said that, it's not the end of the world. Migration flows, I think, will probably fall very dramatically. This, for some people, is a very good thing. I think it's a very bad thing. Selfishly, I live in London, which has kind of become one of the greatest cities in the world, mostly thanks to immigration. I am an immigrant myself. I'm an Irish immigrant to the UK, so I have some stake in this. I have some kind of bias here, but Jonathan Portes estimates that EU migration flows will fall by about 50 to 80%. And that's a very, very dramatic loss. EU immigration counts for about half of immigration into the UK, and that falling by 50 to 80% is a very, very dramatic reduction in talent. Any kind of conceivable visa arrangement, anything beyond giving a visa to anybody who wants one, which is, I think, inconceivable. I think we're going to have quite a strict visa relationship, is going to make it much more difficult for UK firms to hire the people that they want. And we all know that government is very, very bad at doing things like allocating scarce resources where they're needed most. There is no reason to think that government's going to be any better at allocating visas to people that it should allocate them to. Levers, free trade levers, are very, very optimistic about the prospects of trade deals to increase UK GDP. I think that apart from the trade deal that we get with the EU, which is very important because the EU is so large and so close to us, there is almost no trade deal on the planet that will make us noticeably richer. The exception to that is getting one with the United States, which is possible and is probably more likely now that we're outside the EU than otherwise. The projections I've seen for that is that it will raise trade by about 5 to 8% and raise GDP per capita by about half a percentage point. Again, that's not nothing, but it clearly doesn't undo the likely losses from leaving the EU. Trade deals with Australia, I mean, I love you guys, but you're on the other side of the world. It's likely to increase trade volume, that's trade, not GDP, by about 0.2 to 0.5%, increase GDP per capita by an insignificant amount, something that's so small it's not even measurable. The other kind of big gains would be trade deals with China, India, countries like that, but those are so difficult to get, and the UK is relatively insignificant compared to the EU, that I think it's unlikely that we're going to get the sort of trade deal that we would actually like, that we would actually want. So that's the bad news. It probably will make us poorer. It's going to make trade more difficult. It's going to disrupt existing supply chains. And for people like me, who are globalists, it's going to make it much harder for smart, talented young people who pay lots of tax and don't cost very much in state services to come to the UK. So taxes will increase, or the deficit will increase, or if in my dreams, spending will fall. I think that's very, very unlikely, but we'll see. So that's the bad news. The good news is that Brexit may be so disruptive that we will be forced to do things that we would usually never consider. Where I think the biggest gains from Brexit are, or the biggest opportunities from Brexit are in things that really have nothing to do with Brexit, but may become attractive or may become necessary because of the difficulties of Brexit. The UK has one of the most restrictive and one of the most importantly restrictive planning systems in the world. This is particularly important in London. The extreme increase in house prices combined with extreme constraints on supply has meant that London is a very, very difficult place to buy a house in. Rental prices are very, very high, although they haven't risen by that much over the last 10 years, but the level is high. And it's possible that in order to attract investment, it's possible that in order to increase productivity, the government may be forced to deregulate the planning system. This would be counterintuitive, given that the Conservative government has a strong electoral stake in not letting house prices fall and in not letting property prices fall. But it's possible that they may be forced to do this because productivity begins to drag so much compared to the rest of the European Union that we kind of have to do this. Another area where something like that, where a hand may be forced, is in corporation tax reform, either switching to a cash flow tax, such as the one on the agenda that I think is very good in the United States, or in simply cutting corporation tax or increasing capital allowances. Anything like that reduces the cost of investment and increases returns to investment would be very good and would help the UK's very, very poor productivity level. The UK is remarkably low productivity for an advanced economy, and compared to our European neighbours, we're remarkably low productivity, and that may change. We may be forced to do things that will change that. I am not particularly optimistic about these things happening. They may happen, and this is where I kind of dream that they may happen. But I think more likely is that we're going to see quite a strong lurch to a kind of quasi-populist conservative approach to governance. We've seen some of this in the fact that most of the cabinet, most of the kind of ruling clique in the UK were Remainers, and they are now so desperate to prove that they're Leavers, that they're committed to Brexit, that they're kind of doing a weird sort of aping of Leavers. They're doing kind of quasi-xenophobic immigration policy. Amber Rudd's quickly withdrawn suggestion that companies should have to have lists of foreigners working for them, which they then supply to the government, was, I think, an example of somebody who doesn't really understand the Leave mindset, trying to play up to the Leave gallery. Theresa May, I think, has very, very statist instincts, and I think that in order she will play to the kind of populist gallery to try and kind of win that kind of support. I think that's a very bad thing. An interesting test might be the commissioning of HS2, which is a high-speed rail link, the first kind of major high-speed rail line in the UK. There has been a lot of controversy in the last couple of days about whether the French state rail company should be allowed to bid for this. Obviously, under EU rules, it would be allowed to bid for this, but as we leave the EU, we're free to only allow British companies to bid for public contracts. And it may be the case that this is an example of one of the wonderful opportunities of Brexit, that we can force the government to only give money to British firms. I assume most people in this room think that's quite a bad idea, but I fear that might be where we're going. If we get deals with the rest of the world, yes, we may be richer, yes, we may set an example. I don't think it's going to make us that much richer, and I certainly don't think it's going to offset the cost of Brexit. I don't think it's at the end of the world. The best way of thinking of it is, right now we're France, in 20 years' time we'll probably be Italy. Thanks very much.
All right. Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Zoltan, Kesz, and I come from Hungary. And first of all, thank you, Tim, for inviting me to this wonderful conference in Sydney. And besides the fact that I'm here at this conference, I have to emphasize the fact that back in 1956, after the revolution in Hungary, my grandfather's brother left Hungary and never came back, and we never saw any part of that family. And I'm here in Sydney. And as he came to Sydney, I'm meeting his family. I'm meeting my family here in Sydney after 60-some years. So it's another great opportunity for me to learn about new family members. Now, another thing that was mentioned by, I think, Matt, that I was part of you a couple of years ago, coming to conferences, giving speeches, talking about free markets and stuff like that. I'm still part of you. So the fact that I'm in Parliament now doesn't mean that I don't talk about free markets and I don't talk about the stuff that you do. The thing is, and especially when I ran for Parliament, and it was true in Mike's speech before us, that what's the message? What's the message of a libertarian? First of all, coming from Hungary, people just don't care. So people really don't care what you stand for as an ideology. People care about what you can provide to them, what you can promise to them. And there was one simple message that I gave to them. I stand for the West and not the East. And when you come from Hungary and when you come from Eastern Europe, and that's going to offer a very different prospect of what the guys are talking about. As an Eastern European, for me, the EU means something totally different. For me, the EU means something that proved in history was working, and that's peace. For an Eastern European member, the EU also means some kind of a protection from Putin, from the Kremlin. And I deliberately don't use the word Russian because I have no problem with the Russians themselves. I have problems with the Russian government. I have problems with the Kremlin. I have problems with their president. And just one thought in connection with how I became a politician. I became a politician because I was fed up with my government being or my prime minister being the lapdog of Vladimir Putin. I was fed up with the fact that the Hungarian government was the troll of Putin in the European Union. I was fed up with the fact that Vladimir Putin was using my government and my prime minister to disintegrate the European Union, and I wanted to offer some kind of an alternative. In my country, this government had a 2/3 majority, which is a super majority. You can do things. You can change the constitution. You can pass any law that you want. I ran at a special election, which means that only for one seat. And it meant that if I win, they have no 2/3 majority anymore. If I lose, they can continue whatever they want to do. And I ran with no chances, basically. They have the media control. They control everything. Actually, they have more money than we can imagine ever being present. And well, funny thing that as they control the media, the whole country knew more about my sexual life than my wife did. But that's how it is. That's what you have to run against if you live in an authoritarian country, still in the European Union. But I won, surprisingly, and I'm trying to represent the values in the Hungarian parliament, which are pro-liberty values, sometimes called libertarian values. But let me just get back to the theme of this talk, and that is European politics from an Eastern European point of view. And as I mentioned, peace, after the world order changed, after the change of the regime back as the Soviet Union fell back in 1989, 1990, and as the changes took place in Eastern Europe, and as also Fukuyama wrote down, the world has come to, and history has come to an end, we will live happily ever after. Yeah, sure. Would never happened. And one thing that they did not take, or he did not, and a lot of people did not take into consideration is the Russians, is the Kremlin. And I call this the Kremlin connection. And this is one thing that I want to talk about, how dangerous this might be, and how dangerous this might be not only for us, for Eastern Europeans, but also for the whole European Union, and also for the whole world. Now, also, already when about 8 or 10 years ago, when Vladimir Putin described his doctrine for disintegrating the European Union, people were aware of the fact that the first step he was using is gathering a group of parties in the European Union that would represent his interest. Well, he was successful with that. We see all around Europe a multitude of parties that are pro-Russian, that are pro-Kremlin. Even in my country, not only the government party, but extreme right party, which is a neo-Nazi party, I would say, is a very pro-Kremlin party. So with all these parties already in the European Parliament, with a faction in the European Parliament, they are the ones who try to disintegrate the European Union. And for me, this is something that has to be looked as the main enemy of our times. Obviously, from the very beginning of his presidency, Putin wanted to strengthen the position of Russia in the region. If you look at his thoughts, his ideas, well, he used to have a country which was the second most powerful country in the world. He wants to bring it back. Back in 2011, he declared his doctrine called the Euro-Asian Union. This doctrine provides for what he calls the real sovereignty for the post-Soviet countries without the unnecessary bonds of the European Union. Well, sure. What are the unnecessary bonds of the European Union? What does this real sovereignty mean? This is a very interesting thing, because what is Putin's ideology based on? It's based on nationalism, and I think the two previous gentlemen also talked about populism, based on statism, based on authoritarianism. I'm sure this is not what we want, not in Eastern Europe and not in Western Europe either. Now, obviously the first step was looking at these extreme right groups. The second step is looking at legitimate governments who are legitimately elected by the people who would be on their side. Well, in Hungary, my country, they have found a legitimate government who is acting as the messengers of the Kremlin, and he's using these legitimate governments to use his information warfare on the whole of Europe. And when I mean information warfare, is obviously he set up in the different countries, and he supported some Kremlin-friendly media companies. In my country, what I see now is that we are copying the very same things that Putin did in Russia in connection with the media companies. The government is buying up most of the local media, has already bought up national media. People don't have real source of information besides the internet. Internet is the only information source that I would still call reliable. However, in lots of parts of the country, the only source of information you get is state media. And when you look at state media and how they use the state media, it's very shocking. For example, in my constituency, which I represent, I don't exist. I really don't exist. If you just look at state media, print media, or local television, or state television, I've been an MP, and in the past 2 years, virtually almost zero news about me. Because they think that this is a strategy that's working. Ignore people in opposition. And once you ignore people in opposition, you pretend that they don't exist. I mean, that's what they do. I don't exist. And if I go down to a remote village in my constituency, people will ask me, hey, wait, we don't read about you in the county newspaper. Guess why not? And this is the recipe of Putin. This is the recipe that my government is working on, and this is the recipe that they want to spread around Eastern Europe first, and hopefully not any further on. Another very scary thing you might have heard of is Putin's NGO policies. Now, in my country, this is a very crucial thing happening right at the moment. The government has closed down one of the best universities, the Central European University, just a couple of weeks ago. It has just passed. Actually, it is passing a law next week. The Parliament is passing a law next week. I'm going to vote against it in connection with the NGOs, because, and it's again the Kremlin type of NGO policy, labeling NGOs that are supported from other countries. So if you're an NGO, and my former NGO, the Free Market Foundation, has been supported by a lot of foreign NGOs like the Atlas Network, we would be labeled as foreign agents. One of my colleagues in Parliament, one of my opposition colleagues in Parliament, calls this law the Jewish law of the 21st century. Like, you know, remember the Second World War, Jews had to wear the yellow star as a label. NGOs in Eastern Europe, starting with Russia and now in Hungary, are labeled now as foreign agents. So it's going to be very difficult for us, for NGOs, to work under normal circumstances because the circumstances are not normal. So this is basically the essence of the Kremlin politics and the infiltration of the Kremlin politics in Eastern Europe, being very proactive in politics, being very proactive in the media, being very proactive in the so-called pseudo-NGO world. Pseudo-NGO world, I mean, they set up their own NGOs supported by the government. They call themselves civic organizations. However, they are run by government money, and these steps have been taken already. And once you look at my country, for example, Hungary, which is an EU member, which is a NATO member, I think this news is very shocking, that an EU member, a NATO member, could be fooled and fallen into the trap of the Kremlin. Following up, and I have one final statement that I want to make. I'm very optimistic about the European Union now, looking at the trends of the elections going on now. The Netherlands election a couple of months ago. Now, as already mentioned here, a hopeful win for Macron in France, and I also hope that in Germany in September, either the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats will win, so there will be no way for the AfD, for the extremist party to win. So I'm optimistic about that, and I'm optimistic that in 1 year in Hungary, we'll turn the tide back, and even going against all the odds of this in this media environment, we'll change the course of history, and then we'll belong to the West and not to the East anymore. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm privileged actually to come after Zoltan and Sam and Matthew, who described a whole range of issues and policy areas that I think we could go down and further elaborate on. But as described earlier about reluctant Remainers and reluctant Leavers, or moderate, I should say, Leavers and Remainers, I'm a massive Leaver and I'm a massive optimist when it comes to the UK's relationship with the European Union and indeed beyond, outside the EU itself. And I just want to mention in my speech a few opportunities that I think the UK can have going forward outside the European Union, but also the opportunities for countries and people around the world, especially in Australia, as we take on the opportunity of remaking our trade policy outside the EU, one of the first times we've had this opportunity for over a generation. But first, before I get onto that, I just want to illustrate that for the UK, the European Union and our partnership with EU nations has been about principally economics. The UK entered into the then called EEC in the 1970s on the back of an economic common market. We were looking to engage on a tariff-free basis with European nations. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't developed in a particular way that I think, and I believe, hasn't suited the United Kingdom's role and indeed presence in the wider world. And again, our inabilities to take hold of the opportunities that have developed through the wider world because of EU policy, I think has restricted the UK's ability to operate and freely and take back control in a way that it should have control over its laws and regulations. And so the UK has always traditionally seen the EU and the wider world in a very different way as other nations see the European Union project itself. But I just also want to say here, developing on the theme, that the UK's relationship with the EU hasn't always been positive. And going forward, I hope that will be continuing, changing, I suppose. It should change to adopt to the new realities and engage with the European Union on a different playing field. And I think since the EU referendum, there's been a number of positives that come out of this. Theresa May, the new Prime Minister, albeit backing Remain in the campaign, has adopted an approach that is very outward-looking, at least in principle, and the understanding of reframing the UK's relationship with the European Union and beyond, I think, is definitely on the cards. And it's also definitely on the cards with regards to the general election. We are now in a snap election in the United Kingdom. Hopefully, the policy of a clean Brexit will remain post the election result. Of course, that could all change depending on who gets in. But current feelings and current polls indicate that there's going to be a Conservative majority that will be able to implement what was decided last year in the referendum. But the relationship with the EU, I suppose, will change off the back of this. If the UK gives the government a key mandate to engage with the European Union and the negotiation process in a way that gives it strength and confidence in Westminster, then I think the UK can have a better deal with the EU going forward without the costs that have been estimated to be over 11% of our GDP per year by economists, very free market economists like Patrick Minford and Tim Condon. The point is, though, I suppose going forward with this, the EU has a very different perspective. The European Union wants to, of course, create stability amongst its memberships and its economy and grow in a way that, unfortunately, hasn't been able to do over the past few years, but adapt to the new reality that allows it to continue its trading relationship with the UK without any particular costs. Unfortunately, this has come to mean the negotiation position that the EU has laid down has particular drawbacks from the UK's perspective. And this is a challenge the UK will need to overcome. And I hope if there is a clean Brexit mandate during the general election, the UK will be able to engage with the European Union in a much stronger, with much stronger will and much stronger terms, because the European Union currently is looking to restrict the UK's ability outside the European Union, if there is a trade deal, to benefit from its competitive advantages, to genuinely repeal legislation that could engage and reform its trading relationship, not just domestically, but with the rest of the world. And if that happens, then it's almost like a Cameron Mark II. Theresa May has come back with a deal that would really hamper the UK going forward and not allow for the UK to take the opportunities that are out there. Opportunities most notably with regard to trade. And so it's on the EU to soften its position towards the UK, because otherwise there may be the WTO model, which I don't believe we should fear, but again, the UK's desire is to engage with the European Union and indeed peoples around the EU in a different way going forward, and that has to be positive. I think what we saw from Zoltan's presentation is that the countries can throw off the shackles of nations like the USSR, former USSR. But of course, it's about reframing the laws and reframing society from then on. The UK has taken back control, or is in the process of doing so. It's now up to us to reframe the positions for the UK going forward and build a freer society, which I think has hitherto not been able to be achieved. And this, I think, needs a clear roadmap. And again, Matthew is kind to note the roadmap that Ian Murray and I co-authored, not just last year in its second edition, but previously with the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. And basically, I just want to go on to the roadmap and look at the trading opportunities with the wider world, because the opportunities outside the EU, if we leave the single market, if we leave the customs union, means that we can engage with Australia in a hugely positive and beneficial way. And that's because, of course, we're starting from a position of strength. Common language, common law, common understanding, and indeed an engagement to the fifth, we are, as it stands, the UK is the fifth largest two-way relationship trading. I mean, Australia is the fifth largest trader with the UK currently. And indeed, Australia sees the UK as its largest EU trading partner, currently, of course, EU trading partner. But there are huge areas, there are areas within the relationship, economic relationship, that can develop. I note there is huge exports from Australia of gold, but there's also exports of alcohol. The UK consumes a lot of alcohol, and indeed, 1 in 5 bottles of wine consumed in the UK is currently from Australia. This, I hope, will continue. I hope the trend will increase. But it's not just about gold or alcohol. It's about a trading style that I think Matthew touched on earlier, that we could thoroughly develop and go beyond what's currently discussed in terms of trade relationships in trade deals, and reform an understanding globally of what free trade can actually be. Because importing bottles of wine is positive, but also being able to sell in services on a mutually beneficial but competitive relationship, I think will also benefit the UK and Australia going forward. Of course, as developing nations around the world, like India and China, continue on the road to service sectors and what have you, the UK and Australia have unique abilities to sell into that market, and an ability to do so in a trading framework that will allow engaging with these countries, I think would be hugely beneficial, not just to the UK, Australia, but also the developing nations themselves. So I leave you with one thought in the sense of where this goes next. I think the UK has a positive role with reframing its relationship with the European Union. I think the EU needs to change its stance currently when it comes to that negotiation. But I think in terms of the potential of leaving the EU and engaging in the wider world, the positives for the UK outweigh the negatives. The UK, I believe, can be this new world of a Singapore-style global outlook country with a positive story to tell, and to engage with countries around the world, like Australia, to build on the alliances we have, not just economic but elsewhere, I think will be hugely beneficial, not just for the bilateral engagement of the UK and Australia and our citizens, but also, beyond that, set the train of thought, as Matthew noted, for future trade deals and future relationships with countries beyond that. So let's make the positives out of this. Let's take the opportunities. Let's repeal, in a way, domestically in the UK to suit where our economy needs it and suit the future direction of our economic foundations, but also to enhance our relationship worldwide. And I hope that will mean a quick, speedy, and beneficial trade deal with Australia, New Zealand, and everyone else. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Look, I think 3 excellent speeches and 1, subpar effort, and we're ready for questions. So, we've got the questions coming in via the Hoover app. So, if you have the Hoover app, you can submit questions. If not, you might just have to shout aggressively until I recognise you. So, what I'm going to do first, I wanted to pull together 2 questions, one from Jason Potts and one from John Thrasher for Zoltan. Jason has the local version, what I'd see as the local version of this question, and then John's brought it out to the global. So the local version would be, to what extent can you circumvent some of the sort of challenges you talked about as a politician facing an authoritarian government through social media? So to what extent does the new forms of media allow you to get around control problems like state media control? And then as a higher level, the John Thrasher question, are there any optimistic trends in Hungary? more widely? You know, you've obviously painted quite a pessimistic picture. Anything kind of positive to point towards for our Australian friends who might not know Hungary as well as we obviously
All right,
do?
thank you very much. I didn't mean to paint a negative picture. Actually, my election into Parliament is a positive sign already, because nobody thought that could happen. And a very interesting thing that I'm an independent member of Parliament, which is a strange thing in itself as well, because I don't belong to any party, although 6 parties supported me, meaning that they didn't run anybody against me, which is a great support. But yes, it's a positive thing. And answering the second question first, I'm optimistic, although the present election law favors the present governing party. However, if there can be no fragmentation in the opposition, and if there can be some kind of an agreement of, let's put it in a simple way, you remember the movie The Highlander, yes? The Only One Remains. If only one candidate remains against the government candidate and the extreme right candidate, it means that there's a chance that this government can be kicked out. So that's a positive message and a positive recipe coming from my victory at this by-election in 2015. As far as social media is concerned, yes, I mean, we rely, I would say, 100% on social media, or 99% on social media, because it's cheap, it can reach a lot of people. It can also involve a lot of young voters, first-time voters, because they don't really care about the state media, and they don't read the traditional newspapers, don't watch TV. They are on Facebook all the time, so that helps a lot. And also, that 1% that I mentioned, I also have like print media I print it actually once every 3 months when I get some support from an entrepreneur who gives me some money. Oh, Zoltan, print something that people will know the truth from, so that I can print my own newspaper and distribute it with my friends in the constituency. So that helps a lot as well. So I'm optimistic, although we keep a suitcase back at home ready for leaving, but that's just the way it is. I mean, just an example of why it's happening. Just last week there was an activist in Hungary who poured paint on the Soviet memorial in Budapest, and then the next day he comes out in a video saying, "Oh, I'm sorry for what I have done." Yes, because he was threatened by a Russian person living in Budapest, and you shouldn't do something like that, So yes, there is a threat all the time. I get threats all the time, but you shrug it off and you go on living.
So I've got a question from David in New South Wales, who's asking, to what extent, and I'm going to say to you as our token Irishman, Sam, to what extent Irish concerns are likely to play into the EU-UK settlement?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that. I put on my original accent that I put on when I go back to Cork, when I go back home. No, the Irish question is an interesting one. There's a joke about you get an Irishman, a Frenchman, a German, and an Englishman to each write an essay about an elephant. The German does engineering the elephant. The Frenchman does the sex life of the elephant. The Englishman goes hunting an elephant, and the Irishman writes an essay called "The Elephant and the Irish Question." So the biggest, I think it's very likely that whatever kind of deal we get, and I think the most optimistic thing about the election that we're having in the UK is that we almost certainly will get a deal because of this. It's much more likely that we will not crash out with no deal. And I think that deal will probably mean no or very, very few tariffs on goods. I think that's the bare minimum that both parties really would like. Obviously, it doesn't go as far as I would like, but that's something that we can expect. The problem for Ireland is that it's actually things called rules of origin that matter more. So the European Union has quite strict rules checking whether goods that it imports from a certain country were actually made in that country. This is to stop, for example, a free trading Britain from importing at zero tariffs, we'll say T-shirts made in China, and then labeling them as T-shirts made in England, and then selling them into the EU, circumventing the European Union's tariffs on goods from China. So it does rules of origin checks on goods coming in, even goods for coming in from countries that it has no tariffs on, to check that they were actually made there. Now, these can be very time-consuming and they can be very expensive. And this is particularly a problem for agricultural goods, for food and for things like that, as well as for pharmaceuticals, because pharmaceuticals often have quite a short shelf life. Now, Ireland's two biggest exports to the UK are pharmaceuticals and food. It's a very, very difficult problem that may mean that very, very disruptive changes happen to supply chains and to exports between Ireland and Britain. The other problem is the border with Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is not claimed by Ireland. Most people in Northern Ireland would like Northern Ireland to remain part of Britain, and that is what should happen. But when a border comes in between Britain and the European Union, even if that border is only rules of origin, there will have to be a decision made about whether we start to stop people travelling between County Fermanagh and Northern Ireland, between driving, as they have done for many years, with no impediment, with no border checks at all, whether we decide to bring in border checks, which will significantly change and disrupt those people's lives, or whether we decide to have the border not between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but between the island of Ireland and Great Britain. And the problem there, even though that makes the situation much more simple in the short term and much more simple from an economic point of view, it creates a presumption that the island of Ireland is a political unit. And that is very, very problematic for the majority of people in Northern Ireland who do not want that to be the future of Northern Ireland. So I don't see what we can do unless the UK decides to go for extremely extensive cooperation with the Republic of Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland decides to kind of allow British border agents to kind of check goods coming in and British border agents to check people coming in and so on. Unless something like that happens, which I think is unlikely, there is going to be either significant disruption at the border or a decision made about the future of Northern Ireland that will be very, very troublesome for many people living there, and I think may, if not reignite tensions, will certainly make them worse.
So we had a couple of questions, one from Chris Harper and one from someone else who I've lost, about the idea which is being floated called CANZUK, which is Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Done in that order, to address sensibilities about these historical relationships, I think, and the potential for extensive free trade in that as a grouping. Now, the potential that has really depends on the extent to which you think geographical constraints are going to be very binding. It would be a large economic unit by any reasonable understanding of the term, but it will be a very geographically dispersed economic unit. Now, if you were to look at the data and say what drives trade, you would say geography looks like it plays a huge role. But the extent to which that has to be the case, or the extent to which that just is the case, because that's how historical relationships, etc., have built up, and there's a lot of path dependencies are set up, I don't think is entirely clear. I don't think that actually the position that we know that this is a law about things have to be, how things have to be, rather than how it's just how things are, and it might be subject to policy change. But I would say I think it's an exciting prospect for two reasons. Firstly, because these are all countries with a predisposition to free trade, and I think it would be a large enough bloc that I think it could drive forward the boundaries of what's seen as possible in free trade in the way I talked about earlier. And to put some kind of meat on those bones, I think you can look at sectors where deals have generally found it very hard going in promoting free trade. Public procurement would be an example. Huge markets, sadly. We're talking about maybe a fifth of GDP in a lot of advanced economies is the government buying stuff from the private sector for delivery of services. And even the EU, which is normally a kind of high watermark for trade integration across normally now national boundaries, pretty minimal progress in public procurement by EU studies. This isn't particularly a controversial statement, I don't think. I think that's the kind of area where you could see a CANZUK grouping make enormous progress. It would be much easier for cross-border bids to happen because you don't have a language issue. And I think that these are all countries who would be relatively comfortable with that cross-border trade. And I think going beyond trade to things like free movement, because for good or by whatever reason, whether you like the reasons or not, because public attitudes are so positive, particularly in the UK as the largest of the labour markets, but I think generally there's very positive attitudes towards the other members of the Keszak grouping, there is just much lower scepticism towards issues people are generally sceptical of. So migration, which Sam talks about, for example, none of that concern is about a flood of Australians coming to the UK, and I think despite what Brits get up to when they're abroad, I think it's much lower. It's not huge. The main Australian immigration concerns are not about Brits, right? And so I think there is a degree of. We'll see. Yeah. It would be entirely understandable. No one would blame you, right? But I think there's a potential initially in trade, over time in other areas, for a standard-setting engagement within the Keszak countries. And I think there's a willingness to do that politically. What I think the free market movement needs to do is push for that engagement to set global standards, to not put up with getting an FTA, but push for achieving something remarkable, which can help restart what has been a troubled decade or so for global trade policy. The final area where we had a question, so we've got one from Raina. Here's an interesting one. Okay. I've got two questions which I'm going to try and get away with, if people let me get away with this on the time, very quickly. Firstly, Rory, could you speak quickly to other issues in the UK election besides Brexit, which are going to be big, which people should be interested in? And then Zoltan, could you speak to I've got a question from Ezra Relevant, which is nice and confrontational, and we can end on a confrontational question. How can you be upset with Russian interference in Hungary, but be so insistent that foreign NGOs, including those funded by the statist George Soros, be allowed to run rampant?
Good news. Okay, well, quickly. In terms of the other issues, apparently, at the moment, it's Theresa May versus Jeremy Corbyn. It's Jeremy Corbyn's desire to close down NATO, previously said, along with the idea of nuclear weapons and what have you. That is currently the Conservative line of thought, wanting to make this, in effect, a presidential election between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn, on the other hand, wants to move away from the EU issue, which is traditionally a problem for him, and look at public spending in the NHS, education and elsewhere, where he thinks that at least he can shore up the core vote of the Labour Party. So as it stands, the government wants to do the Brexit line, clean Brexit, and mandate for that, along with, isn't it god-awful, potential to have Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. And the other side of it is the Labour Party wanting to make it about the NHS public service and, well, plus ça change, as it goes. There we go.
I want to be brief because we don't have much time. I have no problem about transparency. I mean, private money is already transparent, how private money is spent on NGOs. What I'm worried about is how public money is not transparent at all. So public money provided by the government to pseudo-NGOs is not transparent. We don't know how much they get. And even with this new NGO laws, we won't know it. So that's my answer. There is no transparency in how public money is spent.
I'll wrap up there. I hope it's been an interesting session for you guys. I think there's a lot of. I think you should be interested in EU politics, partly because Europe has shown a remarkable potential to blow up the world over the years, and partly because there's huge change going on in Europe, which will create new opportunities both on the continent and in the UK for Australian businesses, for the Australian free market movement, for Australia in general, and Asia Pacific in general. So I think you should see this as a terrifying but also exciting moment in European politics, terrifyingly exciting, where there's a huge amount to be won or lost. And I hope you found this session helpful in thinking about how. Thank you.